Hi, it's Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer here. It has been a great March as far as I'm concerned. Unusually, we had a spell of about a week of really good spring-like weather where it nudged 60 degrees Fahrenheit just about every day. That must be about, 16, 17 degrees centigrade every day. And the sun was out most of those days, not much wind, and we even started to get some natural pollen by the end of the week. So here in Maine, we don't usually get that very often. It's usually in the 40s, so considerably cooler. So it was a quick spell of time that we could get into the hives and check. I didn't maneuver and look into frames and that sort of thing, but we could really see the state of the bees and get some well-earned food resources into those hives. I went through, checked out all of the mortalities, and so far my survivorship has been exceptionally good. Again, since I switched over to the Saskatraz bees, I've been getting more than 90% survivorship in almost all of my yards, bar one or two where something goes wrong. Last year it was one yard that got mites, presumably from neighboring hives late in the season. This year it was one yard where they were stressed going into the winter because of a lack of food last fall. But overall they've done extremely well. I put that down partially to the Saskatraz bees, partially to wrapping in bee cozies, and also getting my mite strategy right. So those are the most important factors, I think, that have been leading to my success of getting the bees through the winter over these last 3 years, where my results have been pretty much within about 5% of each other, so as far as I can see, which is actually the best results I've had since the 1970s, prior to getting mites in this country. But this time of year we see the weather going up and down. Whereas we've had a nice week, now we've got rain all day today, and whilst it's in the 50s right now, it's heading for the 40s. We're due to get possible snow here on Sunday, and we're in for a spell of more normal spring-like weather where it's high 30s one day and nudging 50 another day, lots of cloudy days, lots of wet days. So we're back to what I would say is a normal spring in Maine. Now, a normal spring in Maine can be pretty stressful. That up and down can be difficult. The wet, dry can be difficult as well. I'm very glad the bees had an opportunity of a week of sustained good weather, because during that time I got checked all of them for weight. I checked all of them I put food resources in those that were light, and I gave pollen patties to all of my hives that had enough bees and honey in the hive, and I had them feeding on pollen substitute as well, free flying for it. So they've had a good stock of buildup. So let's say from about the 20th of March, they should have been doing a fair amount of brood rearing this year. And I'd say this is going to be characteristic in Maine, particularly south of me here, because by the end of this week I saw natural pollen coming in. Now, I haven't seen it in all my yards, but it is starting. And so let's say the week of the 20th of March, they will have started brood rearing in earnest because of the temperature, because of the pollen coming in, or pollen substitute going in. And that means by about the 10th of April, we can expect to start to see that changeover in population of new spring bees, adding to the population, the dwindling population of overwintered bees. And through the rest of April, we should see a fair amount of new bees coming through. So provided that we don't lose bees due to starvation and that sort of thing, or really rapid fluctuations in temperature, I look to see April as having colonies full of bees, as even now my colonies are mostly have clusters which occupy 6 to 10 frames. There's a few hives where I've only got three frames of bees, but although I didn't check the bottoms of the hives yet this season, I can see that I've got some good sized clusters on the whole. Now that leads us to what are the sort of things that we can do in our hives. I've talked about feeding. I'm feeding pollen patties, I'm feeding pollen substitute, I'm feeding sugar syrup where I can. But the safest bet for the hobbyist beekeeper is to continue feeding with winter patties if your hive feels light. If your hive is heavy with honey, you don't need to feed anything. The bee should just let Mother Nature do her thing. The bee should cope very well with the honey that they've got in a heavy hive come the end of March that we're at now. If your hive feels light, then it is important to get some food resources in there. It's a bit cold for them to take sugar syrup, especially now with this coming poorer weather again. The cold is going to make it harder to get sugar syrup in there. So candy, fondant, winter patties, those are the things to go for to be sure they don't starve. As the bees can fly more frequently and more or less daily, then sugar syrup, they start to take more and more sugar syrup. And I'm giving my bees a little richer than 1-to-1, more like 1.5-to-1, because I'm wanting to make sure there's plenty of sugar for all that brood rearing. But the 1-to-1 is more stimulating for them to rear more brood. So that's the feeding. That'll take us well into April, and then it really does depend on what the weather does from there on in, whether we do something with taking off the bee cozies or not, or reversing the brood chambers. And this all depends on the weather to start with. There's no need to take the insulation off earlier than you need to. That insulation will help them maintain a warmer brood nest, which means a bigger brood nest. The warmer they can keep the brood nest, the more combs they can cover, the more brood they're going to rear. So don't be in a hurry to take your winter wraps off. It feels good to be able to see the hives looking like summer, but all you're doing is making them colder. And if you make them colder, they will rear less brood, which means that they're going to be slower in starting up. And if your priority is growth of your bees, keep that insulation on as long as you can. Which then, when do I take my bee cozies off? I take my bee cozies off when I need to go into the super below, for my 2-story hives, that is. The only problem with insulation is it's in the way of doing those sort of manipulations. And so when it comes time that I'm starting to consider reversing the brood chambers to give more room to my brood rearing in the hives, that's when I start taking cozies off. This year I'm hoping that my strongest, biggest clusters are ready to have those brood chambers reversed sometime in April. But that all depends on if the weather forecast is warm enough. I want to see the weather at least into the high 50s in the daytime and staying at least in the mid 40s at night. If it's not doing that, I'm going to keep my cozies on and not reverse my brood chambers. The cluster will go from the top and work its way down into an empty super, albeit more slowly than they would if we reverse the brood chambers and have the empty super at the top. But by doing that, the heat from the warm cluster moves up into that empty super, and that decreases the potential for keeping it warm down below, and that is a potential risk to those bees. So I only reverse the brood chambers to give them more rapid expansion if the weather forecast is warm and that cluster is big. And by big, I mean pretty much filling up that top super and it's starting to expand into the super below. So those are my priorities for feeding, for bee cozy removal or insulation removal, and reversing my brood chambers. Finally, then, at that time, when we're starting to take the colony apart, moving brood chambers around, it's definitely time to sample for mites. The other thing that people ask me about is it okay if I put a mite treatment in now? And we're talking about March. And I say, no, I wouldn't do that unless you've taken a sample which tells you that your mite levels are high. Then by all means do a treatment. The reason I wouldn't do a treatment right now, unless I had to, is because they're still going through a stressful period. If we could have weeks of snow still, and if we start adding that stress and then adding on top of it the stress of a mite treatment, a chemical treatment which is going to hurt some of the bees, kill some of the bees, kill some of the brood, I really wouldn't do it, because you add two stresses together to synergy. It means it's more than the two things added together. It's like multiplying the stress together. So I really wouldn't do that unless samples have told you that it's time that you need to treat. Generally speaking, I don't find that I need to treat my bees. This is just a generalization. So every apiary should be taken on its own merit. But as a generalization, I don't tend to need to treat my bees until midsummer. You shouldn't assume that yourself. Do samples which confirm that to you. But you may have hives that have made it through the winter but did have mites, and they're starting to build up quickly now. Or they start robbing from hives that have mites in the spring, and your mite levels start to build up. Do your sampling, but I wouldn't assume that unless you have other evidence which tells you that there's mites in the hive, like lots of mites in drone brood, it's very early for drone brood yet, then I wouldn't plan on doing a mite treatment until we have evidence to show that it's time to treat for mites. As I say, I typically don't have to until midsummer, but do your testing, and that will be what should guide you. So those are the 4 main points. Feeding right now, taking insulation off at some point, and that usually takes place at the same time I might reverse my brood chambers, and at that time I want to get ready for mites. So that's the planning you want to be doing. I hope that your bees have made it through the winter. If not, if they haven't been flying this week, I'm afraid it's time to order new bees. Your bees didn't make it. So that being said, I hope you're enjoying your beekeeping, and we're just getting close to the time where I can take you out and doing much more in the yards with new hives and how we would do things of growing and all sorts of different manipulations. So spring is here, but we're going to get a glimpse of winter again in the next few days. So that being said, I hope you've enjoyed it. Please press that subscribe button. I'm getting close to 1,000 subscribers now, so please press that subscribe button and share the video with your friends. I hope you did find that helpful. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.